welcome back to another reaction video. Today we're taking a look at Napoleon's Endgame 1814 by Epic History TV. We're getting close to finishing this series, finally. We've been watching it for a few months by now, so happy to get this series done. And don't worry, we'll do more Napoleon in the future. Yeah, let's take a look and see what Napoleon can do in his final great campaign, excluding Waterloo. Peace, peace, it's easy enough to say the word. Am I to give up all that I possess in Germany? Paris, November 1813. At this point, yeah, Napoleon sort of needs to make peace, and he should have accepted anything they offered him. Alas, Napoleon was too prideful of a character to allow himself to be humiliated as such.
In October 1813, Napoleon had suffered his heaviest ever defeat at Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations. Surviving French forces, exhausted, sick and demoralized, retreated to the river Rhine and prepared to defend France from invasion. But in November, the armies of the Sixth Coalition paused their advance, and Austrian Foreign Minister Metternich offered peace terms.
Yes, so why did they pause? Well, the coalition, as we've discussed before, they didn't always agree on much of anything, really. And at this point, they start to disagree about whether to continue the campaign into France. And Alexander I was the only monarch that was really eager to push into France and finish the job. He also had the supports of Prussian generals like General Blücher, for example. The other coalition monarchs were hesitant about pushing France to the extremes. But eventually, after some debate, they concluded that they must continue the war, especially so after Napoleon refused the peace treaty offered by Metternich here.
The Frankfurt proposals would allow Napoleon to keep his throne if France returned to her so-called natural frontiers.
This is a good deal. This is still France as large as it's ever been in history, because it includes Belgium, which has never been a natural part of France. And yeah, they would get to keep some of the revolutionary conquests as well, so it's not a bad deal at all. Unfortunately, Napoleon could not accept it, and I sort of understand why. Napoleon's whole reign is built on continuous success, and it's not built on long dynastic bloodlines and traditions like the House of Bourbon. So even if he did accept this peace treaty, I'm not convinced he would survive the political damage it would cause, considering his reputation has already been tarnished and there's been coup attempts against him already.
It was the best offer Napoleon was likely to get, now that his back was to the wall, and all Europe's great powers were united against him. Even so, he did not accept the terms. He merely agreed to reopen negotiations. To the Allies, and many in France itself, it proved that Napoleon would not listen to reason.
Yes, Napoleon, of course, he was very well informed by his spies and ambassadors about the mood among the coalition monarchs for continuing this war, and he was hoping very badly to have a split within the coalition, and then he would negotiate separately, which would give him an actual chance of defending France.
The war went on, and by January 1814, Napoleon's situation looked even worse. Many of his besieged garrisons in the east were starved into surrender. Marshal Davout with 34,000 men in Hamburg, was now besieged. Denmark, one of France's last allies, was invaded by Bernadotte's Swedish army and made to join the coalition.
Yes. So one of the reasons Bernadotte hesitantly, or rather sparingly used the Swedish army during the 1813 campaign was for this reason also. He wanted those 30,000 men for the invasion of Denmark. And why? Well, he's going to enforce the treaty he signed with the coalition partners, which, as a reward for participating in the war against Napoleon, Bernadotte secured Norway from what was then Denmark-Norway. And he was allowed to gain Norway as a prize, and now he was coming to enforce that treaty. And that is why he has detached himself from the Army of the North, still technically under his command, and he is using the Swedish army to invade Denmark. It was a very short campaign. Denmark never had a chance of resisting, and the Treaty of Kiel was signed as a result. Now, enforcing that treaty would prove to be a bit more difficult. Norwegians didn't like to be under Swedish rule. They would like to be independent. Alas, they were not going to be independent, but that's a story for another time.
French troops evacuated the Netherlands, which reasserted its independence after nearly 20 years of French control. In Italy, Eugene's army faced a new enemy, Joachim Murat, King of Naples, now marching north with 30,000 men to honor his new alliance with the Sixth Coalition.
Yeah, so we talked about this before. Murat was trying to hold on to his throne in Naples, even though the throne was granted to him by Napoleon, which makes this sort of an ultimate backstab. But I digress. Still, it was unlikely that the coalition was ever going to uphold its end of the bargain here, but it was useful for propaganda purposes and of course for the campaign in Italy if Murat went over to their side. But the Bourbon family was always, Bourbon dynasty would always be restored in my mind. And that's what happened, eventually.
In Paris, Napoleon responded to the crisis with a series of extreme measures. Property taxes doubled, state salaries and pensions suspended, 300,000 new conscripts called up, from a country already exhausted by 20 years of war. He ordered the release of Pope Pius, under French house arrest for the last 5 years, to try to shore up his support in Italy.
Yes, Pope Pius the seventh has been under French house arrest for a number of years at this point, and this was due to the fact that the Pope liked to stir up agitation against the French occupying forces, and so he couldn't have the Pope be in Italy for that purpose. And this is not the first time a Pope has resided in France. There was this famous period, the Avignon papacy, where the Pope lived in southern France, and there was a Pope in Rome at the same time, so there were two popes, both making rivaling claims. But yeah, now he's releasing Pope Pius here in order to shore up Catholic support in Italy. And it was a shrewd move, but it's far too little, far too late.
He even agreed to release Fernando, the Bourbon King of Spain, to take up his throne in exchange for peace between France and Spain, a condition that Fernando was in no position to honor.
Yeah, he definitely not in a position to honor that treaty. I mean, the fact is, his countrymen wants to kick out the French and probably get some revenge, and the British were basically in control of Spanish affairs at this point, so he was in no condition to uphold this treaty.
But these concessions were too little, far too late. In January, two coalition armies crossed the Rhine into France. Blücher's army of Silesia and Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia. Outnumbered French forces in their path could only fall back. On the 25th of January, Napoleon said farewell to his wife and son at the Tuileries Palace before leaving for the front. He would never see either of them again. With just 70,000 men, he faced odds of 4-1.
Now, they just said that Napoleon had raised 300,000 troops. Now, you might be wondering, where are those? Well, most of those troops actually went south to defend against Wellington's offensive. Now, Wellington has well over 100,000 men at this point invading southern France. So that's where most of the manpower will be concentrated. And there is some forces here controlling the mountain passes through the Alps to defend against that passage. And then you got Napoleon here. 70,000 men under his direct command. It should be said there were more troops in garrisons and in the other corps. But still, it's not a whole lot to work with.
Most of his troops were raw conscripts, some without uniforms, many just learning how to hold a musket. But for the first time in years, Napoleon's army was so small that he'd be able to exercise direct command over all its movements. The result would be one of the most audacious and brilliant campaigns in history.
If the enemy are foolish enough to cross the Rhine, I will march to meet them, and then you will see the meaning of the world. Debacle. Yeah.
The battle for France would be fought east of Paris, mostly across Champagne, a flat region divided by the rivers Marne and Seine and their tributaries. In late January, fields were dusted with snow, and roads quickly turned to mud.
Now there is one, or two really, major advantages for Napoleon in this campaign that he's never had before. And that is the fact that he is in his own country, which means he knows the terrain better than anyone else. And two, he is in friendly territory, which means he can be supplied with food, ammunition, and other supplies quickly and in abundance. So that's really the two great things that he's got in his favor that helps to make up the difference in numbers.
Napoleon learned that the coalition armies were widely scattered, with part of Blücher's army near Napoleon's old college at Brienne. The emperor advanced rapidly, hoping to trap and destroy part of Blücher's army. But after a hard day's fighting that cost both sides 3,000 casualties, Blücher was able to retreat towards Schwarzenberg's army. That evening, Napoleon was nearly skewered by a charging Cossack, saved only by General Gorgo's good shooting.
Not the first time a Cossacks tried to kill him.
As Napoleon tried to work out the enemy's movements, Blücher, heavily reinforced by Schwarzenberg, made a surprise attack at La Rothière. Allied troops advanced through swirling snow to assault the village, defiantly held by young French conscripts.
Yeah, the Battle of La Rothière was a difficult one for Napoleon because the ground was very bad for moving artillery around, and that was his main advantage really over the coalition forces, even though he had basically no infantry arm anymore and he basically had no cavalry left, but he still had artillery, and that was his great advantage. I wouldn't call it an advantage at this point, but it was the only thing that was still going strong, and he couldn't use them and there was also bad snowy weather, which made his troops get confused and disordered. So yeah, overall the terrain and weather situation was not good for Napoleon at this particular battle.
One was so inexperienced that Marshal Marmont had to personally show him how to load his
Yeah,
muskets
that's
during the
really
battle.
bad.
By late afternoon, Wreder's Bavarian corps was falling on Napoleon's flank. Heavily outnumbered, Napoleon had no option but to retreat, having lost 5,000 casualties and 73 guns abandoned in the thick mud.
That's losses he cannot afford at this point.
The Allies' frontal attacks meant their losses were greater, but by combining their armies, they defeated Napoleon on French soil for the first time. Believing Napoleon would now retreat towards Paris, the Allies decided to advance along two routes to ease pressure on the roads. Blücher would take a northern route along the Marne. Schwarzenberg would follow the Seine. But dividing their armies again would play right into Napoleon's hands.
Now, it makes sense from a logical perspective to split the armies this way. They are in hostile country, so they cannot expect to forage unmolested. And the fact is, they need shelter from the winter. This is 3rd of February. The temperatures are not Russia bad, but it's not pleasant to be outside during this time of the year, even in France. And so they had to split up in order to get shelter, in order to get food, and to ease the pressure on the roads, as they said. The study of it has given me a greater idea of his genius than any other. The Duke of Wellington on Napoleon's 1814 campaign. Yeah, Napoleon's 1814 campaign is very reminiscent of his campaign of 1796 in many ways. He was outnumbered and outgunned, and still he worked miracles to try to win this campaign. Although it was unsuccessful, it is still, among all of his campaigns, this one probably ranks in the top 3 after the Austerlitz campaign and the 1796 campaign. The 1814 campaign probably comes after that. So, yeah, it really displays all of his geniuses, as we will see.
After 2 days to reorganize, Napoleon continued his retreat to Nogent, where he learned that the Allies had split their armies. Not only that, they were advancing at different speeds. The aggressive Blücher racing ahead, while the more cautious Schwarzenberg lagged behind.
And you got to remember here, Schwarzenberg is the one who has far more men than either Blücher or Napoleon, and yet he is the most cautious one by far. It's almost exceedingly cautious at this point in the war. He should be more aggressive, you would think.
Leaving Oudinot and Victor to guard the Seine bridges and delay Schwarzenberg, Napoleon raced north through mud and rain with 30,000 men. The army of Silesia was strung out on the march, oblivious to the danger it was in. First, Napoleon fell on General Osufiev's Russian 9th Corps at Chaumont, destroying it, taking its commander and 2,000 men prisoner. The next morning, he marched on General Osten-Sacken's force near Montmiral. This was a much larger force, with 2 infantry and 1 cavalry corps, and was expecting support from York's Prussian 1st Corps. But the Prussians were late, and Sacken's troops could not withstand the French onslaught. At this desperate hour, the Emperor's elite Old Guard were no longer held back, but were often thrown into the thick of the fighting.
The Old Guard is really being tested at this point. This is some of the most experienced veterans in Napoleon's campaigns, the most experienced. These are soldiers that have at least 10 years service under Napoleon, and at least served in 2 or 3 campaigns. And some of them have been serving in Napoleon's army ever since his Italian campaigns. And so some of these are 15, 20-year veterans. 20-year veterans. So it is Napoleon's most prized possession, and he's always used them sparingly. But at this point, he's got no men to spare. He doesn't got that luxury anymore. And the old guard will prove its worth here, and they will perform heroically during this campaign, showing that they still got it in them.
By the end of the day, Napoleon had inflicted another 3,500 casualties, twice his own losses, and the Allies were in rapid retreat. Napoleon had ordered Marshal MacDonald to cut off the enemy's escape by seizing the Marne Bridge at Chateau Thierry. But York's Prussians got there first. The next day, Napoleon could only batter their rear guard as the enemy fled across the Marne, destroying the bridge behind them. Sending Marshal Mortier to rebuild the bridge and continue the pursuit, Napoleon doubled back to rejoin Marmont, who had been left to keep watch on Blücher. Napoleon attacked at Vauchamp, using General Grouchy's cavalry to outflank Blücher's army, which was soon in headlong retreat. A merciless French pursuit inflicted 6,000 Prussian and Russian casualties. Napoleon lost just 600 men. Napoleon had taken on an enemy army almost twice his size, and beaten it 4 times in just 6 days.
Yes, and this is Napoleon's return to form. This is his famous defeat in detail strategy. So instead of going for Blücher armies when it's gathered and full strength, you go after its parts instead. And he's picked off several corps at this point, which has left the army of Silesia virtually destroyed.
Blücher had lost an estimated 15,000 casualties in battle, and another 15,000 in smaller engagements, as stragglers or deserters.
These numbers are very lopsided, of course, and there is some dispute as to the veracity of these numbers, but it is obvious that Blücher took disproportionate casualties when considering the army strength of Napoleon at this point.
For now, the army of Silesia had been scattered and neutralized. But in the south, Marshals Victor and Oudinot had not been able to prevent Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia from crossing the Seine in 3 places. Austrian troops were now just 40 miles from Paris. Leaving Mortier and Marmont to keep watch on Blücher, Napoleon raced south. Schwarzenberg, alarmed by news of Blücher's defeat and of Napoleon's approach, immediately ordered a retreat. It was too late for Wittgenstein's advance guard, routed at Mormain with 2,000 casualties. Napoleon sent Victor's Second Corps to seize the bridge at Montereau, but was so infuriated by its slow progress that he sacked Victor and gave his corps to General Gérard.
Yeah, so at this point, Napoleon doesn't have time to tolerate failure, and he doesn't have time to be picky about his personnel assignments. And so Victor was sacked. He was given command of the Young Guard, I believe, instead. And he put Gérard as commander of Second Corps. Now, Gérard was one of the finest corps commanders by 1814. He was later made a marshal, not under Napoleon though. I believe it was under King Louis Philippe, maybe? I don't remember. Anyways, he's not a bad replacement choice.
The next day at the Battle of Montereau, the French drove the Allied Württemberg Corps back across the river, with 30% losses. According to some accounts, the Emperor sighted the French cannon himself, as he had at Lodi 18 years before.
Yeah. So is this story true? Maybe not. I would say more than likely not. However, it says something about the man, the myth, the legend of Napoleon, that these stories keep cropping up. It shows his trust in his own troops and the trust they had in turn with him. And this close bond is always something that made Napoleon unique in this conflict. I don't think there's any other commander, especially not an emperor, who was this close to his troops. And yeah, I would not be surprised at all if this story was true. It sounds something like Napoleon would actually do at this desperate hour.
Napoleon had the Allies on the run. But how long could it last?
Not long. Recollect what your military position is. If we act with military and political prudence, how can France resist a peace demanded by 600,000 warriors? Let her, if she dare.
Even as fighting continued, negotiations between France and the coalition reopened at Châtillon-sur-Seine on the 5th of February. The Allied terms were now more severe. A return to France's frontiers of 1791, which meant the additional loss of Belgium, a humiliation that Napoleon refused to accept. Instead, he tried to revive the Frankfurt proposals, hoping to play for time and to split the coalition, whose war aims varied from Britain's hard line to Austria's more ambiguous position. But this hope was thwarted by British Foreign Secretary Lord Castlereagh. On the 1st of March, he persuaded the Allies to sign the Treaty of Chaumont. In it, Russia, Prussia, Austria and Great Britain agreed to keep 150,000 troops in the field and not to negotiate separately with France, while Britain added the sweetener of a £5 million subsidy to be shared among the Allies.
Now there's the kicker right there at the end. The £5 million subsidy, which is an absurd amount of money for this time. But at this point, Britain has long concluded that it would still be cheaper to bankroll all of these other powers than to field a huge field army of their own, which at this point they are practically doing though. Wellington has tens of thousands of British troops under his command. So still, that's the most important part of this treaty, I would say. The subsidy, as they would call it.
The treaty's secret articles specified common war aims, including the future independence of the German states, Switzerland and Italy, while Spain was to be returned to the Bourbons and Holland to the House of Orange.
Yes, this the secret articles forms the basis of the later Treaty of Vienna and the Congress of Vienna, the negotiations conducted there in 1815. And all of these goals would be achieved, although it would not be as easy as anyone would have hoped it would be. And there's one issue that is outstanding here in the secret articles, and that is the issue of Poland, which will become a real sticking point during the Congress of Vienna. We'll look into that in the future.
The four powers even agreed that once they'd defeated Napoleon, they'd form a 20-year defensive alliance to maintain peace in Europe, a sign of their newfound commitment to each other.
Yeah, they actually call this the Holy Alliance. And the one power that was not willing to be a part of it is actually Britain. which is kind of makes sense. They don't want to get involved in the continental squabbles if they don't have to. So they walked away from that. But yeah, this Holy Alliance would actually work fairly well, at least for the first part of the 19th century. And then things would start to become unraveled during the Crimean War and after that.
A split in the coalition had been Napoleon's last best hope for a favourable peace. That was gone. And news from across the country was bleak. French cities were surrendering to the Allies without a fight. Nancy, Dijon and Mâcon had all fallen. In the south, Wellington defeated Marshal Soult at Orthez, forcing him to fall back on Toulouse. 2 weeks later, as British troops approached the city of Bordeaux, it declared loyalty to France's Bourbon kings. The mayor himself rode out to greet the British, bearing a white cockade, the sign of Bourbon allegiance.
This is actually pretty funny, though. It shows you how fickle the people can be. These are the same people, by and large, that had rejected the French monarchy and had joined the revolution. Now Bordeaux was not the center of revolutionary activity or anything, but still, in the cities, the support for the revolution was the highest. It was in the countryside; it was more anti-revolutionary. But still, this this shows that the people knows the writing on the wall, and they want to get ahead of it by proclaiming their loyalty to France's Bourbon kings. They hope to get favorable treatment in the post-war aftermath.
Napoleon's hope for a nation in arms to resist the Allies had not materialized. Allied troops, particularly Cossacks, often robbed French civilians and committed some atrocities. French peasants took revenge when they could, but there was no guerrilla war to mirror what French troops had encountered in Spain or Russia. The chief desire among ordinary French people was for peace, at almost any price.
And it shows you how war-weary France has become at this point. The population is very discontented about the constant wars that is sapping the nation's treasury, that is sapping the nation of its young men. An entire generation of young men has died at this point, and it's a catastrophe in many ways, these many wars. And if this was Europa Universalis 4, France's war exhaustion is about 20 at this point. Those of you who play it will know that reference. Dangers crowded upon him, encompassed him, oppressed him from every side, but he sought to escape from them by misrepresenting them to himself. Marquis de la Colincourt, French foreign minister. Yeah, so basically what Colincourt is saying at this point is that Napoleon is delusional about the situation. He is trying to escape mentally from the situation by perceiving things like he wouldn't do otherwise, now that his back is against the wall. And even Napoleon at this point knows that the game is up, it's just a matter of time. But he still deludes himself into thinking he can get a favorable peace treaty. And it's just not gonna happen. I should say this is not a particularly strange behavior. Many of us, when confronted with a situation we don't like to acknowledge, likes to close in on ourselves. It's a psychological defense mechanism, a coping mechanism, if you will. And that is what probably is happening to Napoleon at this point.
Any talk of Napoleon's defeat in late February was premature.
Oh, definitely.
The French Emperor was driving Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia before him, even though it was twice his size. But Schwarzenberg scrambled to safety behind the River Aube. Napoleon knew he had to land another decisive blow soon, so turned his attention back to Blücher. After an aborted attempt to join forces with Schwarzenberg, Blücher had...
Yeah, you can see that they're starting to realize, hey, maybe we shouldn't be split up. This Napoleon guy is pretty dangerous still.
Had decided to resume his advance on Paris, gathering reinforcements en route, and with only Marmont and Mortier's weak corps to oppose him. Leaving Marshal MacDonald in command in the south, Napoleon set off to intercept Blücher, covering 60 miles in 3 days along terrible roads choked with mud.
It's absolutely insane, the speed that Napoleon is moving at.
At Napoleon's approach, Blücher retreated across the Marne, burning the bridges behind him.
You can see that Blücher, even though he's super aggressive by nature, is still sticking to the Trachenberg plan. At this point, if you're confronted by Napoleon, directly don't fight him, unless you got huge numerical advantages. And it's just following that plan still, and it's working.
24 hours later, they'd been rebuilt by French engineers, and Napoleon was poised to crush Blücher against the Aisne River, because the major crossing point at Soissons was held by a Franco-Polish garrison. But after just a day's fighting, the garrison commander at Soissons tamely surrendered, allowing Blücher to escape. Napoleon continued his pursuit across the Aisne, still hoping to cut off the army of Silesia. But at Chaumont, he encountered Russian troops in a strong defensive position. The Russians fought stubbornly. The French finally forced the enemy to withdraw, but only at the cost of 6,000 casualties, including many irreplaceable veterans from Napoleon's guard.
Yeah.
Napoleon pushed on to Laon. But by now, Blücher had concentrated his forces, 98,000 troops in all, and outnumbered Napoleon 2-1.
Yes, at this point, Blücher's army of Silesia has gotten reinforcements from Bernadotte's army of the north. General Witzengerode, for example, has joined and added the strength to Blücher's forces. So now he's pretty strong, and Napoleon simply does not. He does not have the men. He does not have the cavalry. He does not have the artillery, and he does not have the seasoned troops to make this assault work. But he's still gonna try.
French attacks were repulsed, while Marmont's corps was caught off guard by a late Allied counterattack and routed. Napoleon was lucky to avoid a much heavier defeat. Blücher, usually aggressive to the point of recklessness, was unwell and had been told Napoleon's army was twice as big as it was, leading him to act with unusual caution. Laon was a heavy blow to Napoleon. 6,500 casualties he could not afford.
So both at Chaumont and Laon, he's lost perhaps over 10,000 men. And that is just losses he cannot afford at this point. It's not viable.
Undaunted, he fell back to Soissons, and after a brief moment to reorganize, he marched on the city of Reims, which had just fallen to Saint-Priest's Russian corps. In a whirlwind assault, Napoleon retook the city. Saint-Priest himself was mortally wounded, his corps routed.
And symbolically, this is a very important city in France. And this is where traditionally French kings have been coronated, if I'm not misremembering my French history. Someone will correct me otherwise then. But still, Napoleon, despite it all, despite having suffered 2 brutal losses against Blücher, still manages to just shake it all off, reorganize, and counterattack. And that's just what he keeps doing all this time. And you gotta give him that. Napoleon was incredibly tenacious. Of course, during all campaigns he fought, but especially this one. This was truly a fight for survival.
Meanwhile, in the south, Schwarzenberg had resumed his offensive as soon as he found out Napoleon had gone north.
Here we go again.
In heavy fighting, he'd driven Oudinot and
It's like a seesaw
from the river
battle.
5 days later, the Allies had recaptured Troyes, as MacDonald retreated behind the river Seine.
MacDonald doesn't get much of a choice at this point. He's just so heavily outnumbered, and without Napoleon, it doesn't stand a chance. He kind of needs those troops.
Now, after 4 days to rest and reorganize his battered army, Napoleon was coming south once more. Schwarzenberg, emboldened by news of Napoleon's defeat at Laon, decided that this time he would stand and fight. Napoleon advanced on Arcis-sur-Aube, ignoring reports that the enemy was not retreating as he believed, but gathering for battle. As heavy fighting broke out, Napoleon still believed he faced only the enemy rearguard. It was a nasty surprise to discover that he faced the entire might of the army of Bohemia. 28,000 men against 80,000. In desperate fighting, Napoleon personally rallied fleeing troops and exposed himself to enemy fire, having his horse killed under him by an exploding shell. But the odds were too great.
This is what one must respect about Napoleon. He was there on the battlefield himself. Where is Alexander I? Where is Francis of Austria? Where is Frederick William? Nowhere. They are not even close to the battlefield. They're in their comfortable headquarters. Meanwhile, Napoleon is out there personally rallying troops, exposing himself to enemy fire, rallying the men, and if you're gonna command troops, you might as well be there for your troops, and that's what I personally respect about Napoleon. So,
at the end of the second day, Napoleon was forced to order the retreat.
I saw the glorious death, disputing foot by foot the soil of the country. The balls flew around me, my clothes were pierced, but none reached me. Yeah, so what Napoleon is getting at here is, well, it's obvious. He tried to die in battle as the warrior he saw himself, and he was a warrior. And I also think that I think this a battlefield ending would have been more fitting end for Napoleon's story. Instead, he died in a very inglorious manner on an island far, far away from France. And yeah, that's just how it goes. He was extremely lucky never to be hit by a cannonball or a bullet or anything like that, especially when he was out there at the end, 1813, 1814, when he was often personally rallying troops.
Napoleon believed his army was now too weak to take on the Allies directly, so he decided to change strategy. He would march into the rear of the Allied armies, join up with some of his isolated garrisons, and cut the enemy's lines of communication, forcing them to abandon their advance on Paris.
So what Napoleon is trying to do here is trying to sort of replicate the Russian strategy, basically. He's trying to disrupt lines of communications and supply and distract them, basically. He tried to, get them to abandon their advance on Paris and the Allies were not exactly certain what to do, but there were some events that made them favor an advance on Paris nonetheless.
But the Allies, until now always one step behind Napoleon, had just received crucial information. Talleyrand, the most brilliant French diplomat of the age, and the most slippery.
Oh yes.
He'd served France's monarchy, the Revolution, then Napoleon, until in 1807 he fell out irrevocably with the Emperor over foreign policy.
Yes, so Talleyrand is indeed a brilliant diplomat, he's a brilliant statesman, and he's one of the great names of this era, alongside Metternich. And, well, he had served as Napoleon's foreign minister, and their dispute ended their relationship, and that was over the fact that Talleyrand never wished to impose the sort of harsh peace treaties that Napoleon always favored. And when the Treaty of Tilsit was signed and Prussia was punished so severely, they simply could not bridge the divide anymore between them. So he retired from service to Napoleon. But Talleyrand was always an active political player, and now that he was seeing France on Napoleon rather on his ropes, he decided to try to get in good with the Allies here. Generously, we could describe this sort of person as a political survivor, although one could prefer the term cockroach too.
He now believed that Napoleon was dragging France into ruin, and worked behind the scenes to ensure his downfall.
And he was not alone.
From Paris, he wrote to the Russian Emperor Alexander at Allied headquarters, informing him that in the capital, support for Napoleon was crumbling, and the city's defences had been completely neglected.
Both of those facts are true.
He urged the Allies to march immediately on Paris, without allowing Napoleon to distract them. Talleyrand's information was confirmed when the Allies intercepted a report from Napoleon's chief of police, General Savary, meant for the Emperor. The treasury, arsenals and powder stores are empty. We are completely at the end of our resources. The population is discouraged and discontented, wishing peace at any price.
And I believe General Savary replaced Fouché as the Minister of Police. Now, Fouché was a very sketchy character, just like Talleyrand, and he was also working behind the scenes to ensure Napoleon's downfall. But yes, the report is accurate, though. France is at its end of its resources at this point. There's simply no more resources to continue the war. And the population was discouraged and discontented. And, well, this alongside a letter to, I believe, the Empress, detailing Napoleon's plans to advance into the rear, convinced the Allies that they needed to advance on Paris and not be distracted.
As Napoleon advanced on Saint-Dizier, the Allies sent General Witzengerode and 10,000 cavalry to harass his army and to screen their own movements.
I don't think Napoleon has 10,000 cavalry combining all of his troops at this point, which says something about the terribly desperate situation he's in.
Then began their march on Paris. At Fère Champenoise, they collided with Marmont and Mortier's corps, advancing to join Napoleon. An entire National Guard division, 5,000 men, was virtually wiped out as the marshals suffered a crushing defeat. Napoleon feared that the fall of Paris would be a fatal blow to his regime. His political authority and ability to wage war might not recover.
That assessment is probably accurate. Paris is the center of administration of the French government, and without the administrative and bureaucratic resources of Paris and all the other resources it could provide, it is hard to see how Napoleon could continue the war.
So, when he received news of the Allies' movements, he tore up his plans and ordered a forced march back to Paris, intending to lead its defense in person.
That would have been something.
Napoleon's wife and son were evacuated from the capital, along with most of his ministers. His brother, Joseph, the ex-king of Spain, was in charge of the city's defenses, but had done little.
And this is typical of Joseph. Among all of the siblings Napoleon had, Joseph is the one he trusted the most. And that is why he was put in charge of Paris's defenses. Because he simply did not trust anybody else at this point. He was sort of a bit paranoid about it. And rightly so, I would say. Considering how many conniving, treacherous people like Talleyrand around. But Joseph, I don't know. He didn't do anything to help Paris withstand an assault, and although it would have never made a real difference in the strategic term, he might have bought enough time for Napoleon to arrive in the city and lead the defense in person. Alas, it was not to be.
Paris was awash with rumors of treachery and defeat. Marmont and Mortier were able to reach Paris before the Allies, adding their troops to the garrison. It now totaled 37,000 men, including some hardened veterans of the Guard, but many more young conscripts, while a third were part-time soldiers of the National Guard. The Allies had 120,000 seasoned troops outside the city, and given the urgency of taking Paris before Napoleon could intervene, their elite guards and grenadier divisions would lead the way. On the 30th of March, they began their assault from the north. Heavy fighting raged throughout the day. The city's defenders fought bravely, inflicting several thousand casualties on the advancing enemy. But defeat was inevitable. That night, to save Paris from destruction, Marshal Marmont agreed to surrender the city, on condition the garrison was permitted to leave with its weapons. At the Hôtel des Invalides, the 71-year-old Marshal Serrurier oversaw the burning of 1,400 flags and standards captured from France's enemies, as well as Frederick the Great's sword and sash, so they would not fall into Allied hands.
The fact that the French had 1,400 standards to burn shows you the absolute dominance of Napoleon during the past 10 years. The fact that he had collected so many goddamn standards from all his victories. It's a very impressive collection, which unfortunately were burned. Would have been nice for historical purposes. And of course, Frederick the Great's sword and sash is another treasure lost to history. And, well, I think that's a very pity that we could not at least keep the sword and sash. So, yeah, it's unfortunate, but I could see where they're coming from. I mean, it's a great humiliation if all of these standards were to fall back into enemy hands. It's a matter of pride and honor.
Napoleon was just 15 miles from Paris when he was informed of the city's surrender. He sat with his head in his hands for 15 minutes.
The jig is up. We do not intend to expose Paris to the fate of Moscow. Marshal MacDonald to Napoleon, Fontainebleau Palace. yeah, here we go with the Marshals' Revolt. Despite all of the setbacks here and Paris being taken, Napoleon insisted on marching on Paris and retaking it. But everyone knew, and even Napoleon knew, that it was a doomed effort. It was never going to be recaptured with the amount of troops the Allied had there. But still, regardless, he wanted to do this as a final Hail Mary act, whatever you want to call it. But his marshals and ministers unanimously opposed it, and they had a sit-down, slug-out talk with Napoleon. I wouldn't really call it a talk, it was more of a shouting match. That where the marshals tried to make Napoleon see sense and, see reality for what it was, that the war was lost.
On the 31st of March 1814, France's enemies marched into Paris for the first time since the 100 Years' War. Parisian crowds cheered the three Allied monarchs, bringers of peace. Everyone in Paris was suddenly a royalist once more.
Oh, how convenient.
Above all, they cheered for Emperor Alexander of Russia, now hailed as Europe's savior.
Isn't it ironic? Emperor Alexander of Russia is the most autocratic leader of Europe at this time. He was even more autocratic than King Louis XVI. And now they cheer for him. Well, you could argue Napoleon was equally autocratic, but still, it's quite a shift in tone from the Parisian crowds. And of course, this is what I mean by what the people are fickle, because in 10 months or so, Paris will welcome him back as a liberator from the terrible royal family again, and suddenly we're all Bonapartists again.
Don Cossacks bivouacked on the Champs-Élysées. Allied troops generally behaved well. "35 miles away, Napoleon was at Fontainebleau with 36,000 men, all of them hungry and exhausted after their 100-mile forced march. Nevertheless, Napoleon began planning an immediate advance on Paris. But for the first time, he faced unanimous opposition from his ministers and marshals, including Ney, MacDonald, Oudinot, and Berthier.
And those are the most senior marshals present at this time. Soult is down in Toulouse, defending against Wellington, of course, so he can't be there. Davout is still holed up in Hamburg at this point, and he won't surrender until the next month or so. So, this is a show of opposition that has never, ever been seen in Napoleon's reign, or even his military career. Nobody has questioned him like this, and it shows you the situation they were in. It was so obvious to everyone. They just needed a real talking to, about the realities of the situation.
They reminded him of his oath to act for the good of France. He accused them of disloyalty, acting only to save themselves. They told him the war was lost, and he must abdicate in favor of his son if possible.
I mean, they're both right. Many of the marshals and the ministers clearly wanted to save themselves by making Napoleon abdicate. But they are also correct in that the war is lost.
On the 4th of April, Marshal Marmont surrendered his entire corps to the coalition, which was marched over to the enemy lines against the wishes of many of its officers and men. This was a devastating blow to Napoleon, and encouraged the Allies to reject his offer of a conditional abdication in favor of his son.
The conditional abdication of his son, it was never going to happen. There was a slight chance, maybe, but I don't think so. The Allies were pretty set on restoring the House of Bourbon, except Alexander I, who wanted Bernadotte on the throne. He was a bit out there. But yeah, this is a great betrayal by Marmont, and it's a very unfortunate one. Marmont is in many ways Napoleon's protege, and seeing him march over with the troops like that, it's really a devastating blow for Napoleon in terms of his plans to retake Paris, but also personally, it must have felt like a great betrayal.
2 days later, he abdicated without conditions. The Allied powers, having proclaimed that the Emperor Napoleon is the only obstacle to the re-establishment of peace in Europe, the Emperor Napoleon, faithful to his oath, declares that he renounces for himself and his heirs the thrones of France and Italy, and that there is no personal sacrifice, including his life, that he is not ready to make in the interests of France.
A very short but powerful abdication letter, and although the other powers had recognized Napoleon as emperor through treaty, Britain had not, and here they were sort of forced into acknowledging Napoleon as emperor of France only in defeat, which is pretty hilariously ironic.
Napoleon's abdication was formalized by the Treaty of Fontainebleau, by which he was allowed to keep the title of emperor, become sovereign of the small island of Elba, and retain a bodyguard of 400 men. News came too late to prevent Wellington's attack on Toulouse, leading to a costly and pointless battle, with more than 7,000 casualties. The night after his abdication, Napoleon tried to commit suicide, using the poison that had been made for him in Russia in case of capture. But it had lost its potency, and he survived.
No matter how hard he tries, he cannot die.
2 weeks later, Napoleon bade farewell to his old guard at Fontainebleau Palace.
This is a very famous scene, and if you ever seen the movie Waterloo, you can see this scene being depicted. It was a very, by all accounts, a very emotional scene. Napoleon bidding farewell to his old guard, kissing the standard of the guard before leaving, and many old veterans were weeping when he left. And yeah, it was a really devastating, emotional goodbye for everyone involved.
And began his journey into exile.
I have been wrong, maybe in my plans. I have done harm in war, but it is all like a dream. Yeah, having achieved so much only to be brought down like this, it must have felt like a dream. I could really see how one would feel like that.
The Napoleonic Wars, which had raged on land and sea for 11 years, seemed finally at an end. The death toll is unknown, but historians estimate that 2 to 3 million lives were lost across Europe.
That's probably about right.
Most soldiers died not in battle.
Although the one big question mark is the amount of civilian deaths, which were not at all documented at the same level of proficiency. So we don't really have a great idea about how many civilians died. 650,000, maybe. I think that number is closer to 1 million, at least. Especially considering how many civilians perished in the Russian campaign and the Spanish War of Independence, the Peninsular War. But the military deaths, that makes more sense.
But from disease, many thousands were left maimed and disfigured. For most of this period, Napoleon was master of Europe. imposing treaties on humbled enemies, redrawing frontiers, overthrowing old regimes, and making new kings. He was the last figure in history to combine total political power with frontline military genius, in the mold of Alexander and Caesar.
And we will never see their like again. I said this last video, but I don't think we will ever see character like Napoleon or Caesar or Alexander the Great, one of these great historical figures, greater than life personalities. Yeah, the circumstances of the world are such that it will not, they will not spawn men like this again, and it's a bit shame, really, isn't it? Never ever get to witness someone like this. I imagine what it would have been like for the people living in this era, watching someone like Napoleon rise and fall. Must have been quite something.
But it seemed Napoleon's reign was to end in abject military defeat. However, exile on Elba did not prove to Napoleon's taste. In less than 10 months, he would return to France to fight one last great campaign to reclaim his throne.
Alright, that was Napoleon's Endgame, France 1814. Next time we'll be finishing off the series with the Waterloo campaign, and then we will be going back and watching the newly released Battle of Eylau. We'll be doing a reaction to that too. But in the meantime, if you have anything to add, please leave a comment. I will try to respond. And if you like the video, like, subscribe. You all know this whole thing. And join the Discord, by the way. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.